Hello everyone. From the last couple of videos, we learned everything about implicit binding and explicit binding. In this video, we will be going through all those scenarios using arrow functions. So let's check this example. So here you can see that this script is running in strict mode, and if you call get this, you will get undefined printed. So we already covered this. So if you see, undefined is printed. Now let me change this function to an arrow function. So now this is an arrow function and I'm calling this arrow function. Now you see the value of this printed is the window object, which is the global object when we run JavaScript in the browser. So what is happening here? So when it comes to arrow function, there is no this binding when we call an arrow function. Arrow function does not have its own this. So whenever we invoke the arrow function, if we are using this keyword inside, it gets the value of this from its surrounding or from its lexical environment. Now in this case, you can see that the lexical environment of this arrow function is the global environment. And in global environment, the value of this is the global object. So in this case, it will be window. So when you try to get the value of this in this arrow function, it will give the value of the global this. So for example, if you try to get the value from outside like this, and I'm not calling this function now, you can see that window is the value of this. Now let's take another example. So here again, this is a normal function, and inside the function body I have created an arrow function inner, and at line number 8 I'm calling inner, and here I'm calling get this. Now when this function is invoked, at line number 8 inner is invoked, and inner is trying to print the value of this. So here, what will be the value? So when we invoke inner, since this is an arrow function, it does not have its own this. So it will use the value of this in its lexical environment. Now for this arrow function, its lexical environment is the outer function, which is get this. And in the outer function, the value of this in strict mode is undefined. So here we will get undefined. So let's check this. You can see that undefined. Now let's change this. Let's convert this into an arrow function and this into a normal function. So here, this can be an arrow function like this. Now here we can change it to a normal function. Okay. So what will happen now? So let me add a console.log here as well. Outer, and this is inner. So here again, I'm calling get this. So here it will print the value of this in the outer scope, and inner is invoked. And from inside inner, we are trying to log the value of this. So here again, get this is an arrow function. So at line number 4, it tries to access the value of this. Since this arrow function does not have its own this binding, it will use the value of this from outside. Now from outside, the value of this is window. So window will be printed here. Now inner is invoked. Inner is a normal function which have its own this binding, and in strict mode the value of this will be undefined. So if you save this, you can see that we have window in the outer environment and undefined in the inner environment. So this is the basic difference between arrow function and a normal function. Now the question is, why do we need this difference, or why do we need arrow functions in the first place? Which means we have function keyword function for everything, and we can do everything with the function keyword functions. Then why do we need an extra function? So let's check this example. So here you can see we have a simple object, and inside that object we have a value property, its value 0, and we have a method called outer. And inside the method we are trying to access this dot value, and we have another function created using the function keyword, and we are calling inner. And inside this function we are trying to access this value field. Right now we are calling the outer function using this object, and we know that this will give you the value 0 because inside this outer method, since we called outer using this obj, that this value will be obj, so obj dot value will be 0. Now when it comes to inner, for whatever reason, let's say we need a function inside and we need to access the value of this inside, so we created a function and we are calling inner. So inside this function, the value of this will be undefined in strict mode, right? So this is a new function created using the function keyword, and it have its own this binding. So we won't get the outer this inside. So let me save this, and you can see that you get 0 outer from this log, but when this function is invoked, the value of this is undefined, and there is an error thrown, cannot read the properties of undefined reading value. Okay, so there are several solutions to this problem. So before ES6 we didn't have arrow functions, so one way to do is we can create a variable here, let's say self, and we can give the value of this to self. So whenever we need to access the outer this, we can use this self variable inside the inner function. So here instead of this, let me give self and inner. Okay, let me save this. You can see that 0 is printed in the outer environment and 0 is printed inside the inner environment. Okay, now there is another way we can solve this problem. So we can remove this, and when we call inner, we can use the call method, and here we can just pass this. Now inside this inner, self dot value become this dot value. So here we are calling the inner function by using the call method, and we are passing the value of this from the outer context. So we get the value of this as obj because we are calling outer using the obj. So let me save this. You can see that. So we get 0 from outer and 0 from inner. Now using arrow function, we don't have to do this because we can simply convert this inner function into an arrow function. Now we can just simply call inner. So how this works now? So we are calling obj.outer. So inside this outer method, the value of this will be obj. Now this is an arrow function. So arrow function does not have its own this binding. It uses the value of this from outside, and from outside the value of this is obj. So we get obj here. So obj.value is 0. So we get 0 outer, 0 inner. So this is one of the reason they have introduced arrow functions in ES6. So whenever we have scenarios like this, we can simply use arrow functions. Now let's check call, apply, and bind methods, how these methods work with arrow functions. So this is a simple arrow function which prints the value of this. Now let's use call here. And we can simply pass an object with a name field, John. Okay, so here saying call get this and use the value of this as this object. Now we are using this inside, right? Now save this, and now you can see that it prints window. It is not printing the object that we passed, which means call is not working as expected. Why is that? The reason is since arrow function does not have a this binding, it cannot change it, right? Because there is no this binding for this function. So this is essentially similar to using call method with a function which does not use this inside. So here, this actually points to the value of this outer. So this points to the lexical this, not the this inside this function. So here essentially we are not using it's on this. So get this dot call cannot change the lexical this. It says if it uses it's on this, which is not with arrow function. So that's why it still prints window. Now if you use apply, again the same case, because arrow functions does not have this. So if you see, window is printed 2 times. Same case with bind. So let me change this to bind. Now bind returns a new function, and in the returned function we are saying that in the returned function, if it is using this, use the value of this as this object. But again, this is an arrow function, right? So there is not this. So if you invoke this, so bind returns a function and I'm invoking it, again we get window object. Okay, so basically if we want to change the value of this inside an arrow function, we will not be able to do that because arrow functions does not have a this. Now there is another case with the bind. Okay, so let me create another function. So here is a simple function, an add function which receives 3 numbers and it returns the sum of the 3 numbers. Now you can see that it is not using this. Even if it is using this, it will be the lexical this. Now using bind have another advantage. So using bind, we can create another function from a function, and bind can be used to pre-fill some of the arguments or all of the arguments. So here, let me create another function. So here you can see that I'm using the bind instance of the add function, and I'm passing the value of this as null, because anyway this is an arrow function, so there is no this. So passing null, and as the first argument I'm passing 10. So this will return a new function where the first argument will always be 10. So using bind, we can create new function which is more meaningful or more declarative. So add here is a generic function which receives 3 arguments. Now add 10 says that, okay, give me 2 values and 10 will be added to those 2 values. So now if you call console.log add 10, and we only have to pass 2 values, so 4 and 3. Now 7 plus 10 is 17, so 17 will be printed here. So you can see. Similarly, we can create another function, const add 10 and 20. So add dot bind, passing now 10 and 20. Now add 10 and 20 only wants the third argument. So let me copy this. Okay, so add 10 and 20. Now we just need to pass a single value, 5. So 30 plus 5, 35 will be printed. So you can see that 35 is printed. So even though we cannot use a bind to change the value of this for the arrow functions, it still have this use case. Okay, now finally, we have arrow functions and we have function keyword functions, and when to use arrow functions and when to use function keyword functions. So let's check the older example. So here you can see that we created the obj object and we have value and an outer field. The value of outer field is a function, but here we are using an arrow function. So if our expectation is to get the value of this as obj when we call outer using obj, we won't get the value of this as obj, because here the method is created using an arrow function, and arrow function does not have its own this binding, so it will use the value of this from the lexical environment, and the lexical environment is the global environment here. So the value of this in the global environment will be window. Okay, so we won't get this. So if you save this and see undefined, because window object is not having a value field. So whenever we need to define methods, it should be function keyword function. So we can simply change this to function. Okay, now if you save this, you get 0. So this is one instance where we should use function keyword function. Now there is a shorter syntax for this. So most of the time we write like this. Now this means that here we are using a function keyword function. Okay. Now the scenario where we use arrow function is whenever we have a method like this, and if we have another function inside that method, and if that function needs to access the lexical this, instead of creating a function keyword function, we can just create it using the arrow function, so that we don't have to use bind or call or apply, or we don't have to create a self variable outside to get the value of this and pass inside. Okay, so that's the scenario where we use arrow function. So here, for example, so function inner console.log this. So here, when you call obj.outer, and here inside, if I call inner like this, you don't get the outer this inside, because this is a function keyword function, and it have its own this binding, and this will be undefined. Now, when you need outer this, you can simply change this function to an arrow function. Const. So this way we can simply access the lexical this. So there are more differences between arrow function and function keyword function. We will be looking all of those in the coming videos. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video.